Body. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we move into Memorial Day weekend. Nermeen?
We turn now to a major new investigation that reveals how, after the longest period of war in American history, the number of soldiers being discharged for misconduct is at its highest rate in recent times. Many of the soldiers are wounded veterans who served multiple tours of duty. When they are kicked out, they lose their medical care and other benefits for life. A three-part series published this week by the Colorado Gazette features the story of several such veterans, including Army Sergeant Gerald Jensen, who had the lower half of his face shattered by an IED in Iraq. After it was reconstructed, he then redeployed to serve in Afghanistan, where he was injured again. When he got home, he faced a less than honorable discharge after he tested positive for the drug amphetamine. He asked to be retested, saying his many Army prescriptions might be to blame. But his commander refused and instead gave Jensen the maximum punishment, cutting his rank to private, docking his pay, and canceling surgery to fix his face so he could spend weeks mopping floors, picking weeds, and scrubbing toilets. This is Jensen speaking to the Gazette about how soldiers don't seem to have the same workers' compensation rights as everyone else.
If you were walking down the stairs with your briefcase in your hand and your stack of papers in your hand, and you tripped on a corner of the rug in your office building and fell down the stairs, would you expect the people that you work for to pay for your medical bills and take care of you if you weren't able to come back to work? Why shouldn't we? The reason why it's a bigger deal with us is because usually somebody doesn't jump out of a corner in the stairwell and shoot you with an AK-47 when you're at work. They expect us to fulfill our contract that we signed when we enlisted. They expect us to follow our orders. They expect us to do what we're told. They expect us to die if that's what happens. So in that contract, they agree to take care of us when we agree to serve. They're not taking care of us.
That was former Army Sergeant Gerald Jensen, his jaw badly damaged. His story is part of a major investigation published this week by the Colorado Springs Gazette called Other Than Honorable. Top Army officials have so far refused to comment on the series. For more, we're going to go to Denver right now to Dave Phillips, the reporter who uncovered the story. He's also the author of the book Lethal Warriors, When the New Band of Brothers Came Home. In 2009, he wrote the award-winning two-part series, Casualties of War. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dave. Tell us more about Gerald Jensen and how he fits into this three-part series that you have now just published.
Gerald Jensen is really like an incredible story. I think most civilians would have, it would be impossible for them to imagine. He's a man who got hit by an IED while driving through downtown Baghdad, and it went right through his head, right in front of the ear, out this other side, and essentially shattered the entire lower part of his face, including his sinuses. He wasn't supposed to live. He was in a coma for months. Doctors assumed if he ever came out of it, he'd be brain dead. And the day that he woke up, he got out of bed and was walking around. And after 13 surgeries, he told the doctors, the Army doctors, hey, I want to go back and serve my country again. I want to deploy with my old combat unit. And so he did. He went back to Afghanistan, and he went to a really vicious corner of the mountains in the south, right along the Pakistan border. There he was put in charge of a little mountaintop outpost that took fire from the enemy almost every day. He was injured there again when he was running to a gun post and fell and re-broke his face. He went back again to the United States, where he was scheduled to have many more surgeries, and he went into a wounded warrior battalion, a special unit in the Army that was created to care for these seriously wounded troops, help them get better, help them transition out of the Army. He said when he got there, he encountered a hostile environment where soldiers who were struggling with all sorts of issues were written up for the smallest things. He himself was written up for little things like not showing up to 6 a.m. Formation because he had bad infections in his sinuses. He tested positive for amphetamine, and he said to the Army, hey, look, I'm on Sudafed from the Army. Would you retest this? I think it's a mistake. And this is a man who had had a spotless record before. And the Army said, I wouldn't believe this if I hadn't heard a tape of the conversation. His commander of this special medical unit said, I'm not going to retest that. That's not our job. Instead, she recommended that he scrub toilets, even though doctors were saying, this guy's too sick to do this type of stuff. And maybe most upsetting of all is while he was doing all this extra duty, he had been scheduled to have surgery to have dental implants because he'd lost all his teeth in these injuries. And the commander, he says, canceled his surgery. And to this day, he has no teeth.
So let's go back to Gerald Jensen, here describing his encounters in Fort Carson's warrior transition with sergeants who had never deployed before and who treated the wounded harshly.
And the extra duty I was assigned was pulling weeds, feeding out cigarette butts, scrubbing toilets, mopping floors, sweeping floors, scrubbing stairs, and cleaning the barracks, things like this. And when I told him, this is violating my profile, it's making me worse, it's making my injuries hurt worse, I was having to take more pain medication I was being prescribed by the doctors. I was told to man up. I was told that this wasn't, they had taken great lengths to determine whether or not my profile said that I could do these things or not, and that they had come to the terms that my profile wasn't being violated by doing these things. And I asked them, I said, well, okay, to pull a weed, what do you have to do, bend over to pick it up, pull it? Because it says no bending in my profile. And I can't squat either because it says no squatting. And I can't crawl on my hands and knees to do it because it says no crawling. And they said, no, you can do it. Man up. Just do it.
So Dave Phillips, that was Gerald Jensen. Can you tell us what happened to him, where he is now, and also how you came across this story initially?
Well, Gerald Jensen's unit recommended for him for an other than honorable discharge. What that would mean is that even though he has serious medical issues, he would lose all benefits from the VA. Now, he could technically apply and appeal to the VA to try and get those benefits back, but that process can take years, and oftentimes it's not successful. So really, they were sort of cutting him off and casting him out. He is obviously a fighter, a person who is going to get knocked down and get back up again. And so he decided that he was going to do everything he could to keep that from happening. And what it took was going to generals far above anyone at Fort Carson and saying, look what they're doing to me after what I did for the country. You have to stop this. And finally, at the last minute, they did, and they medically retired him. But, there's a lot of people whose wounds aren't as obvious or who aren't able to stand up for themselves where that doesn't happen. They're just cast out.
And how did you come across the story initially?
This all started when we started seeing more and more soldiers in the jail in El Paso County. And I went to see one of them, and the Army had literally pulled him out of a psychiatric hospital against his will and driven him directly to the jail. And I thought to myself, my God, what are they doing? What's going on there? And so I started asking around to people that work with veterans closely, and they started connecting me with some of these people who were being thrown out even though they had multiple tours, even though they had obvious injuries, even though, at least from a civilian point of view, their misconduct was relatively minor, considering their sacrifice. And so we really wanted to make sure that some of these stories were told.
So let's turn to another of the veterans you profiled in your series, Cash Alvaro, who talks about how he struggled with PTSD since returning from Afghanistan in 2010, when he was labeled by his Army unit as a malingerer and thrown out for misconduct.
Battle buddies, we've seen things, we've been through things that's never going to leave your mind. It's always going to be there. Losing, close friends, people you used to, hang out with, people you trained with, they're not going to be here. And just to come back and have someone tell you, oh, you're just acting out. Oh, you're just looking for sympathy. And those people just don't understand. Not everybody I mean, if you have a strong heart, that's good. That's good. But there's people in the world that don't. You know, you lose somebody and it'll break you. When you lose 11 people, it's going to break you. You come over, you deploy with all these people, you expect to go home with all these people. And if I make it another year, 2 years, 3 years, I'm fine with that. If I make it till next week, I'm fine with that too. So I just want to know every soldier that puts up with it and fights that battle, that there's always going to be, we'll rest one day.
That was wounded veteran Cash Alvaro. The Colorado Springs Gazette's Dave Phillips spoke with him again recently. This time he was in the emergency room in Colorado Springs on April 26th after having a seizure, blurred vision, and numbness in his leg. Alvaro said his problems started shortly after he was injured by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan in 2009.
What happened?
I had numbing and tingling in my leg today and yesterday, and then I've had severe headaches and double vision in my left eye, and I haven't been really able to focus. And my sleep is also I can't sleep at that very much. Only a couple hours.
How bad had your vision gotten?
Oh, my left eye is completely blurry. And my right eye, okay. I can see some things with my right eye.
So why'd they bring you into the hospital?
Because they were afraid that I might have this onset of a stroke.
Any idea what the doctors think?
No, not yet. They gave me a CAT scan and drew blood already.
That's Cash Alvaro. Just a couple weeks ago on April 26th, Dave Phillips, you were at his bedside. Where is he now? How does he fit into this story?
He's, a really sad case. One of the reasons we thought maybe that the number of discharges were going up, misconduct discharges were going up in the Army, was that a lot of these guys might have invisible injuries, PTSD or a traumatic brain injury that you couldn't see, and a lot of times even doctors can't tell, the severity of them, what is misconduct and what is an injury. But Alvaro had a documented blast injury. Afterwards, he started suffering regular seizures, headaches, heart spasms. And his unit kicked him out anyway for minor stuff. They thought he was, quote unquote, a dirtbag, a liar, and they didn't like him. And it didn't matter that he was seriously injured. They kicked him out, and they kicked him out in a way that kept him from getting benefits for the rest of his life. So, you kick out a 22-year-old kid who is having seizures regularly. He can't work. He can't get unemployment. He's had no family to fall back on, and he's homeless right now. He's staying for a little while with a veteran here in Denver who's helping him out, trying to get him some medical care, but he has nothing. He has nothing at all.
I want to ask you about an email obtained by the Gazette that shows Fort Carson's legal advice on kicking out wounded soldiers. It reads, quote, "If you're dealing with these kinds of cases, we recommend that you seriously consider preferring charges and offering Chapter 10s to get the soldiers out quickly. I think it's time to start teaching these kinds of soldiers a lesson. Now you just have to make sure that the offenses would qualify for a Chapter 10. Just because a soldier is pending pending court-martial does not necessarily qualify the accused to a Chapter 10. It has to be an offense punishable with punitive discharge, plus other limitations. Dave Phillips, can you talk about the significance of Chapter 10 as against Chapter 14 and what it means when soldiers are discharged with a Chapter 10?
Yeah, it's a lot of Army jargon, but let me cut through it and explain it as simply as I can. Getting kicked out of, most people get kicked out of the Army if they're going to get kicked out for misconduct through something called Chapter 14. And all that means is it's the chapter, the regulation in the Army regulations is number 14. And Congress a few years ago put safeguards in place that say, hey, if you're going to kick someone out through Chapter 14 and you think they might have PTSD or a TBI, there needs to be all sorts of additional evaluation. And if it's shown that there might be a possibility of connecting the behavior, the misbehavior with the injury, you can't kick them out. You've got to medically retire them. Well, that's problematic for an Army unit that wants to kick out a soldier who might have these issues, because it takes a lot of time. It can take months or even over a year, and it might not be successful. So that what they found out is they could use this back door called Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is a regulation that says, hey, if you've been court-martialed, if you're facing prison time from the Army, you can volunteer as a soldier to say, I will resign from the Army if you don't prosecute me. And it was supposed to be a win-win. The Army doesn't have to prosecute cases it might not want to. The soldier can get out of a possible trial and going to jail, and they both walk away. The soldier loses his benefits. What they started doing, what this email says is, hey, Chapter 10 skips all this medical review because it's voluntary. And so what you should do is take these soldiers that you would normally just kick out and tell them, we're going to court-martial you, we're going to put you in jail unless you sign this Chapter 10. And what we found is after that email was written at Fort Carson, the number of Chapter 10s there went up like 300%. And Alvaro was one of these. He had only done minor misconduct, showing up late. He stole a BlackBerry that didn't belong to him. He went AWOL for a few weeks. But when they got him, they threw him in jail, and they kept him there for a month, and then they said, look, if you sign this paper, you'll get out of jail. And he did. What they didn't tell him is that he would also lose his benefits for the rest of his life.
Let's hear from another soldier you interviewed for your Other Than Honorable series. This is the 3-tour Special Forces Sergeant Paul Sassy, who the Army diagnosed with PTSD. He sat in solitary confinement without charge for months after assaulting his wife and 2 military police officers. You spoke to him while he was in jail, Dave.
I was at the top of my game. You know, I gave everything, and then as soon as my PTSD started getting really bad, they just gave up on me. It's quicker and it's easier just to kick guys out, and then, you know, and then have the jails get filled up with them. You know, I've done 3 deployments for this country, and this is the thanks I get. I get assaulted by guards. I don't get to even talk to my children. You know, I'm not saying what happened was right, but I don't know what happened. And I'm trying to get in a treatment program to make sure that never ever happens again. And the Army is denying me the ability to go to a treatment program.
So that is 3-tour Special Forces Sergeant Paul Sassy. In 2012, he's diagnosed with PTSD. Doctors give him a mix of contraindicated drugs that make him manic, you report, Dave. And a few weeks later, he slams his wife's head against their Jeep until she's covered in blood. Take it from there and what has happened to him, what has happened to her.
Well, you know, it's a long time coming because Paul Sassy was blown up in Iraq, hit by a roadside bomb in 2007. And he was having what we would probably recognize now as classic symptoms of both a brain injury and PTSD. When he came back from that deployment and he went to the doctors asking for help, he said, you know, I can't sleep. I'm having nightmares. I can't sleep. I can't concentrate. They diagnosed him instead with attention deficit disorder and a sleep disorder, and they gave him ADD medicine during the day, and they gave him sleep medicine to make him sleep at night, and they never addressed the issues. And they just, you know, he kept deploying after that, and things grew worse. You know, and when they finally did diagnose him with PTSD, they gave him medicines that government guidelines say shouldn't be mixed, that are dangerous to mix. A few weeks later, he assaulted his wife, beat her up bad, and beat up the military police that came to stop him. Of course, they threw him in jail, right? Where else can you put someone like that? But the people he served with in Iraq, officers at Fort Carson were saying, hey, take this guy out of jail and put him in an inpatient treatment place. This guy's sick. He shouldn't sit in jail. Fort Carson didn't respond. What's tragic about that is he sat in jail totally unmedicated, growing even worse, and he assaulted guards in the jail. And so he's facing charges for that, and if he's convicted of those, he faces 15 to 48 years in jail for something the Army did.
All right. David Phillips, you've also pointed out that Department of Defense studies have shown that both brain injuries and PTSD make it far more likely for military members to be discharged. Can you explain what you found out about why that's the case, and if there's any link between the military's difficulty in identifying mental illness in general, which may also have something to do with the increase in the level of suicides?
Yeah, there's been studies, numerous studies, both by the Department of the Defense and by civilian researchers that say people with brain injuries, people with repeated deployments, people with PTSD are much more likely to run into all sorts of trouble, whether it's a misconduct discharge, whether it's divorce, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's being arrested in the civilian world. And I don't think anyone disputes that. Where the Army runs into trouble is the people that are often trying to make the initial decision of what is misconduct and what is an injury. They're trained as junior officers meant to lead Army units. They're not mental health experts. They're not brain injury experts. And so it's really hard. There's no definitive way to say this is an injury and this is misconduct. And so a lot of times, or at least sometimes we know, people make the wrong decision.
But do these soldiers, do they have some kind of medical examination, or is it just their superiors in the military who examine them and determine whether they have
there is more and more examination of these guys. They get examined when they right when they come home from deployments, 3 months after that, 6 months after that, 9 months after that. The staff of behavioral health clinics in the Army has ballooned in the last few years. But there's also a backlash to that. Leaders can look at people who go to and use these medical resources as fakers, as people that want to get out of work and go to appointments, as people who are trying to bilk the Army of benefits. That doesn't always happen, but we've seen a number of cases at Fort Carson where the command simply doesn't believe the doctors that say, oh, your soldier has a brain injury or your soldier has PTSD. And so they go after them anyway.
As we wrap up, just this issue that you, in sum, find in this remarkable three-part series, more soldiers being discharged for misconduct than at any time in recent history. The feeling you get from this piece, the military sends these guys off to war, men and women, and now doesn't want to pay for them being taken care of, to do with sequester, to do with downsizing. And no matter how horrific their crimes are, like this guy Sassy beating up his wife, they are then just released into society if they're not arrested, and they're not taken care of at all.
That's right. First let me say, if you want to see more photos and video and read these guys' stories, it's at Gazette.com. But you're absolutely right. The Army's difficulty in dealing with this is not an Army problem. It's a societal problem. We're talking about over 2 million people who've deployed in the last 10 years. Over 500,000 of them have more than 3 deployments. These are people who may have issues that they need our help with. And if the Army isn't sort of the first responder, the person that gets them on the right track, and the Army, in fact, through its actions, is banning them from care for the rest of their lives, that's going to affect our society for a really long time. We may be experiencing another thing like we saw with Vietnam vets.
Dave Phillips, we want to thank you for being with us. We will certainly link to your series at democracynow.org. Investigative reporter who covers military veterans for the Colorado Springs Gazette. His three-part series published this week is called Other Than Honorable. He's also the author of Lethal Warriors, When the New Band of Brothers Came Home. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to Madison, Wisconsin, to talk about Occupy protesters, not just journalists, but protesters being spied on by the government. Our next guest, the editor of The Progressive, is calling for the resignation of Attorney General Eric Holder. Stay with us.
Don't you know you're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. Don't you know you're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper. While they're standing in the welfare lines, crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time in the unemployment lines, sitting around waiting for a promotion. Don't you know you're talking about a revolution? It sounds like a whisper.
Talking About a Revolution by Tracy Chapman here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We end our show with a look at newly revealed documents showing how police partnered with corporations to monitor the Occupy Wall Street movement. DBA Press and the Center for Media and Democracy have obtained thousands of pages of records from counterterrorism and law enforcement agencies that detail how so-called fusion centers monitored the Occupy Wall Street movement over the course of 2011 and 2012. These fusion centers are comprised of employees from municipal, county, and federal counterterrorism and homeland security entities, as well as local police departments, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. The documents show how Fusion Center personnel spied on Occupy protesters, monitored their Facebook accounts, and infiltrated their meetings. One document showed how the Arizona Fusion Center dispatched an undercover officer to infiltrate activist groups organizing protests around the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, the secretive group that helps corporate America propose and draft legislation for states across the country. The undercover officer apparently worked for the benefit of the private entity ALEC, despite being on the public payroll.
Democracy Now! Reached out to the Phoenix Police Department to join us on the show, but they declined our request. Sergeant Trent Crump in the Media Relations Department said in an email, quote, Occupy Phoenix presented itself with a great deal of civil unrest over a long period of time. We monitored available intel all the time as it is used for intel-driven policing. Intel dictated resources and response tactics to address, mitigate, and manage this ongoing activity, which was very fluid and changing day to day. This approach ensured that citizens can exercise their civil rights while we protect the community at the same time, they said. Well, for more, we go to Matt Rothschild, editor and publisher of The Progressive magazine, wrote the cover story for the June issue of the magazine, Spying on Occupy Activists, How Cops and Homeland Security Help Wall Street. The piece drawing heavily on the documents obtained by the Center for Media and Democracy and DBA Press. Matt Rothschild's also the author of You Have No Rights, Stories of America in an Age of Repression. Matt, welcome to Democracy Now! Just lay out what you have found.
Hey, Amy, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I mean, these documents from the Center for Media and Democracy and DBA Press show that law enforcement and Homeland Security have equated protesters, left-wing protesters, as terrorists. They've diverted enormous amounts of resources from counterterrorism efforts to spying on these local protesters. And then they've collaborated with the private sector, some of the very institutions, banks, that these protesters were aiming at. And as you read in that statement from the Phoenix Police Department, the effort was to mitigate these protests. I mean, why is law enforcement, why is Homeland Security in the business of mitigating protests?
Well, I want to go to a response that we received from the Phoenix Police Department when we reached them for comment. And they said that they were not treating Occupy protesters as potential terrorists. They said, we are an all-hazards incident management team. We have gathered information at all types of events, including the Super Bowl, World Series, SB 1070 protests, etc. So can you say how it is that their monitoring of Occupy protesters differed qualitatively from the other events that the Phoenix Police Department named?
Sure. Well, they're using resources from the Arizona Counterterrorism Information Center, the Arizona Fusion Center, and they're using Homeland Defense personnel in the Phoenix Police Department to track Occupy activists. So it's a little disingenuous of them to say they're not treating these protesters as terrorists when they're using their own anti-terrorist personnel to spend a lot of time simply tracking these activists. One of the police officers who was on the Homeland Defense Bureau of the Phoenix Police Department said she was primarily spending her time tracking Occupy activists on social media.
We also asked the Phoenix Police if law enforcement is infiltrating Occupy meetings, and he replied, quote, infiltrate? No. Attend open meetings? Yes. Democracy Now! Also asked Trent Crump if law enforcement tracked Occupy activists online. He replied, yes, we gather intel on a number of social media sites regularly. So what about this? And also this issue of law enforcement monitoring the protests against ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. When we asked him this, he said, yes, public safety. Your response?
Well, they not only monitored the ALEC protests in late November 2011, but they also sent a face sheet to the security personnel for ALEC, a face sheet of the faces and names and identities of Occupy protesters who've been doing some activism in the Phoenix area to make the ALEC security personnel aware of who may be coming to their protests.
So the police are working with the companies and the organizations.
Absolutely. Yeah, they were working with security for the American Legislative Exchange Council. They were also letting security know when Jesse Jackson was going to be in town to join an Occupy protest and an ALEC protest. Is that really their job, to be passing information on to these private entities? And then with some of the bank protests that Occupy Phoenix was planning, they were giving downtown banks all sorts of information. Give downtown banks everything they need. That was one internal memo from the Phoenix Police Department when it was a day of protest against these banks, and Occupy was urging the bank customers to cut up their credit cards from these banks. And which banks are we talking about? We're talking about Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, some of the very targets that Occupy had been, protesting against. So the question is, who are the police department working for? Are they working for citizens? Are they working for the private sector? Are they working for the banks?
Can you put, Matt Rothschild, can you put this in a wider historical context? Is this kind of surveillance unprecedented in the U.S.? And what accounts for its occurrence during Occupy in the way that you describe?
Well, unfortunately, it's not unprecedented. There's a terrible history of law enforcement and the FBI spying on left-wing activists going back to the COINTELPRO program of the FBI in the 60s and 70s, where they infiltrated the Black Panther movement and the American Indian movement. But interestingly, after those revelations came out, there were guidelines imposed by the Justice Department itself, the so-called Levy guidelines. Edward Levy was the Attorney General under the Ford administration, who said you can't go spying on and infiltrating activist groups in this country unless there's a predicate of criminal activity. Well, after 9/11, the Bush administration and Ashcroft as Attorney General completely destroyed the Levy guidelines and let law enforcement do any kind of infiltration they want without any necessity for any hint of criminal activity on the part of the activists.
Matt Rothschild, you've called for the resignation of Attorney General Eric Holder. Why?
Well, for a number of reasons, Amy. First of all, for this scandal about investigating reporters. I think that's outrageous. We had more than 100 AP reporters and editors that the Justice Department was gathering information on, and now we have the revelation about the Fox News reporter James Rosen, who is being accused of being a co-conspirator under the Espionage Act of 1917 simply for doing his reporting job. Also, the Attorney General has been essentially waging war war on whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. And on top of that, let's remember, this Attorney General, Eric Holder, has been rationalizing the assassination program that the Obama administration has been engaging in, saying that a drone can drop a bomb on a U.S. citizen anywhere in the world, and that U.S. citizen will already have had due process simply because the Obama administration itself, or the president, or the Secretary of Defense calls that person a terrorist. Now, that's not due process, and that's not what the Justice Department should be doing. Certainly the Attorney General, the chief law enforcement officer of this country, should know better than that.
Well, Rothschild, isn't he just carrying out President Obama's policies?
Well, he very well might be. And then we have a more serious problem. We have a serious problem at the very top with the President of the United States, again, like George W. Bush, engaging in illegal activity.
We want to thank you for being with us. We're going to do part 2 of the interview and post it at democracynow.org. Matt Rothschild, editor and publisher of the Progressive magazine, wrote the cover story for the June issue, Spying on Occupy Activists, How Cops and Homeland Security Help Wall Street. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Our website is